Russia has waged war on Ukraine for over 35 months, and today we want to review the military situation. I'm Julian Repke on BILD Situation Room. And we start with brutal, yet unfortunately very realistic footage from the western Russian region of Kursk. The Ukrainian army has released a series of detailed images that illustrate how North Korean infantrymen are endeavoring to defend themselves against the relentless assault of Ukrainian FPV kamikaze drones. And we see this desperate struggle for survival, which mostly ends unfavorably for the North Koreans, as they try everything possible to shoot down this drone at the last moment. We're observing in this scene the first North Korean who is likely trying to hurl a radio device at the passing drone. Nevertheless, the entire endeavor seems quite pointless, as in the end we consistently witness the drone crashing directly into the presumably North Korean soldiers. Still, the facial features, uniform style, and operational area strongly suggest it. And the Ukrainians, who are doing a lot of intelligence work here, are saying that as well. These are not Russian soldiers, they would act differently, perhaps join other units. These are North Koreans who have once again been sent in large numbers to Kursk by the hundreds, likely sent in their thousands with the aim of breaking through the Ukrainian lines. However, we see that in the end, it's actually a whole lot of soldiers, supposedly up to 12,000, who are said to have been sent by dictator Kim Jong-un to support dictator Vladimir Putin, who are now tragically paying with their lives for probably being sent to the front lines, likely not with their consent, but rather against their will to defend Russia. We have some additional footage from Kursk that we'd like to take a closer look at. They reveal a critical moment, specifically the rotation scenario, when a unit is either reinforced or replaced. And this moment is particularly critical because during such an instant, the position of the respective unit is frequently revealed to others. Here we see two vehicles of the Russian army in a recaptured village. And once again, we see they are civilian vehicles, not army vehicles. They are simply off-road vehicles with a relatively large trunk that are used to move a mortar unit, to supply one that has just landed here in a partly destroyed but not yet completely destroyed village. Now we're seeing the situation here just as I have personally experienced it myself before. This is a critical moment when everything is quickly taken out of the vehicles, when the old things, and sometimes even the old soldiers, the deployed soldiers, are removed from the position. And we can see here how this all has to be done rather quickly. You just run back and forth loading the ammunition. However, the problem is when this moment is seen, when this moment, for example, is spotted by a surveillance drone, no matter if it's Ukrainian or Russian, then we have the situation where this position becomes exposed, and in that particular case, the artillery that we will see in a moment can slowly and surely zero in on exactly this position. That's why these rotations often take place at sunrise and sunset, so that neither thermal imaging drones operating at night nor those with standard vision during the day can have the optimal or most advantageous view. Just on what happened. In this case, the Russians were unsuccessful, and you can clearly see what got exchanged here. You can see now, because the drone has become aware of this position, that here in a, well, not backyard, but in a ruin, the roof is already missing from this building. A mortar was set up, so it was probably also mortar ammunition that was exchanged or that was acquired here. We can see now how the mortar is being unveiled, and at this point it's the 82nd Ukrainian Army Airborne Brigade, which is attacking here with artillery based on this information, based on the knowledge they've acquired, targeting this house in the small village of Kursk. What is being increasingly bombarded here and eventually leads to the total collapse of the entire position, the mortar position, and presumably also the Russian soldiers stationed here were eliminated. As I mentioned earlier, it's a critical process with constant rotation, and it demonstrates well what's occurring in this situation. When such a position is revealed, then the coordinates are made known. The soldiers also always mark everything on Google Maps or other programs and clearly say, we know there's a position there, and accordingly you then have time to concentrate on it. Overall, the situation in Kursk remains quite similar to the previous few days. The Russians have not succeeded in reversing the Ukrainian advance towards Ulyanok here. That implies the Ukrainian forces have successfully managed to push approximately 4 to 5 kilometers further in the southeast direction. On the other hand, we had already mentioned that the situation in the western part of the section is relatively critical for the Ukrainians because Sverdlikovo has been partially recaptured by the Russians, leaving us with not many villages. Between Sucha, as marked here, Sucha remains the only city still under Ukrainian control, and the Russian advance is significantly supported by North Korean forces, which are being conducted from the northwest, moving towards Sucha in this particular instance. Starting from Kursk, we head to Donetsk, situated in eastern Ukraine. We have numerous new videos here that we fully intend to watch and analyze thoroughly. Let's begin once more with the Russian fiber optic drones, which are being utilized more and more frequently, particularly in the eastern region of Ukraine. We are currently observing an attack being executed by a fiberglass drone targeting a fortified T-72 tank that belongs to the Ukrainian army. And it's situated in Kostiantynopil, which is a quaint little place found close to both Kurakhove and Andriivka. We'll take a closer look at that on the map shortly, and we'll observe how the Russian drones managed to spot this tank discovered here. It's rather well concealed and deeply entrenched, now commencing to attack using drones one after the other. And we can already see at the end there's been quite a bit of destruction here. We don't see yet that this Contact 1 armor has been penetrated, but we can clearly see the fire damage now, which we didn't notice in the initial footage. That means the Russians at least assume that they have caused damage here and that this T-72 tank can no longer be used. And what we're seeing now are quite interesting recordings. We had already mentioned a few months ago that, according to reports from Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, it is sometimes the case that because of these fiber optic drones, we have something like spider webs on the trees and along the streets. And here we see it, I believe, quite clearly for the first time. What looks like spider webs, we see it in the middle. I can now briefly cover it. So all this stuff here that is illuminated by the sun, these aren't cobwebs, they're actually fiber optic cables. These are the cables from dozens and dozens of drones that were deployed along this road in order to determine the position of the enemy, most likely the Ukrainian position, to launch an attack. And we can very clearly see what the situation looks like when those fiber optic drones keep flying by and naturally lose their cables along the way. They just remain there and get blown by the wind into the next tree, and that's essentially how it ends up looking. Ukraine describes it to us, as we mentioned before, as though the trees here are entirely enveloped in cobwebs. This is the reality. While we examine the situation on the map, we have received some very concerning news for the Ukrainian army that has just come in this morning. We just observed the attack launched by one of those Russian drones targeting the area of Kostiantynopil. At this moment, we're witnessing a notable advance by the Russian army into the city of Kostiantynopil. They have now only just arrived at the village outskirts, yet also near Ulakli, though not marked here, you can see a bit of the roads in the center, and it seems that the Russian army has succeeded in the last 24 hours to make a push from the southern direction, managing to breach through the established Ukrainian front lines, thereby seizing control of at least half of this last corridor that they have been attempting to hold onto here, to gain a foothold there in Ulakli, and accordingly, it's also a very bad situation for the remaining Ukrainian troops near Dakhny, and once again, it's just a trap. You can see it here. Based on the footage, the Ukrainians now have to free themselves to just barely exit this area south of Andriivka and then set up a new front once again, moving further west, especially beyond Kostiantynopil. As mentioned, this information is from Deep State Map, a source we trust considerably because this provider always stays consistently and incredibly current with its maps and maintains strong ties to the Ukrainian army, thus knows what happens. Nevertheless, there still aren't any recordings yet from either the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. As mentioned, brand new information that reached us here this Sunday morning is that once again the Ukrainian front has been breached, and this U-shape that we've repeatedly discussed in recent days, this lying U, as we have observed here, was breached from the south, which unfortunately means the Ukrainians are now compelled to retreat yet again and establish new defensive lines even further to the west than before. Despite the challenges, the situation is critical for both the Ukrainian and Russian armies. Repeatedly, efforts are made, often under the shield of night or far away from the main front lines, to deploy and effectively utilize multiple rocket launchers. These are the so-called BM-21 Grad rocket launchers, and we have two very recent videos from the Ukrainian army showing us how these launchers are being engaged. Here during nighttime, we can see that a Ukrainian surveillance drone has just detected that a Grad rocket launcher is currently in operation right here. Right now, launching the rockets, and now we see an FPV kamikaze drone which can fly up to 20 kilometers behind the front because that's the range of the Grad rockets attacking here, and precisely this vehicle. What's in action here? A soldier escapes at the last second, also just attacked. In fact, the soldier we just saw is now running away here. I think you can see him quite well here as he moves away from this explosion. Next, even though the rocket launcher, capable of holding up to 40 rockets, is exploding right here, and the rockets are fired uncontrollably in all directions. And in this respect, having another Grad rocket launcher has now been defeated here. Soon we'll see an even more critical situation, even tougher for the Russians. We can now see the loading of a Grad rocket launcher. This means on one side we see the launcher, in this case on the right side. I can mark it for you. Here we are able to see it. On the other side, we can see the loading vehicle. This means a type of vehicle that initially transports these rockets all the way to the front line. And then it's passed on to another vehicle to move closer to the front again, as mentioned, at a maximum distance of 20 kilometers. And from there, they are fired. However, a Ukrainian long-range surveillance drone, we see that's the unit up there with their logo, has spotted this operation far behind the front lines. And we now see that Ukraine is deploying long-range artillery or rocket artillery to actively disrupt and interfere with this loading process here, or to destroy both vehicles at once. Here we see it again. Down here, you see the two vehicles parked one behind the other, kind of in the shadow, if you will, of a destroyed building in a captured city. And now we see the explosion occurring relatively low down. Nonetheless, both vehicles are significantly and severely affected by it. In just a few moments, we will see the wild and uncontrolled launching and firing of rockets that are coming from the front vehicle. That means the 122mm rockets that have already been loaded are now just fired into nowhere here. And then we also see that we have that specific loading vehicle over there, which has also unfortunately caught fire, and both vehicles, including the missiles, were destroyed. And also, and this is important for Ukraine, the Russian soldiers, whom we have to pixelate here too, who operated the Grad rocket launcher and brought up the other equipment. Loading this sort of equipment needs training. In this case too, most of them died during the attack. We see one more person jumping down, but afterward, as we'll pixelate, he remains down, like the others now that are already on the ground, likely due to the initial explosions, possibly a HIMARS rocket from Ukraine, maybe something else. And just because of this whole inferno, what developed afterwards around the mortar and its loading vehicle, we'll take a look at two additional videos of Ukrainian precision strikes targeting Russian army units. An attack on a surveillance drone, or rather the vehicle that launches the surveillance drone of the Orlan 10 type. And now we see how strategically this is being approached. That means we have another Ukrainian drone that has spotted the whole thing. We now see how 155mm cluster munitions are used to attack this entire loading process, or rather the setup process here. Again now, I hope you can see it here, this circular large explosion around the target, which means the impacts, the various explosions we see, and we're seeing now the impact again aimed at the infantry, which was either killed by it or at least forced to retreat. And now we see how systematically both the vehicle used by the Russian army is being targeted here. This is the first. And also here, I hope you can see it in the last moment, this is the Orlan 10 standing here. That was just about to be launched, is currently being targeted and also eventually destroyed by another drone. This indicates that the Ukrainians are operating in a very systematic manner. We can see the wreckage of the drone as they counter the infantry, the vehicle, and the drone consecutively. To effectively eliminate all the critical components of this chain, encompassing all the various elements of this Russian military unit present here in Ukraine. And at the end, we see two attacks on a very, very strange weapon system. A temporary weapon system used by the Russian army known as an RBU-6000. This is a rocket launching system that was originally designed to be mounted on ships. It was intended to fire rockets from one ship to another or against submarines over several kilometers, essentially mirroring how the Grad launcher operates on land. We can observe this monstrous system set up back there. Here you can see it clearly. That's the launcher and that's the truck, and shortly it will come under attack twice by Ukrainian drones. I think it's even clearer now. This is not originally meant for the Ural truck where it's mounted here, but it's actually supposed to be installed on ships. Now we can see the consequences of it, so to speak. Here we saw the first impact in the driver's cabin of the Ural, and the second impact is now directed at the system itself. And the fact that the Russians are using this shows us just how successful the Ukrainian army has become at combating the rocket launchers in recent years. So many of them were destroyed that over time the Russians actually dismantled the RBU-6000 from their old warships and then mounted them on various trucks, including MTLBs. Here we see another attack, in this case from a drone that doesn't crash itself, but flies in low to then drop grenades against another RBU-6000. We now also see here how uncontrollably these rockets are fired, and now here, the aftermath, if you will. Another one of those trucks with a very monstrous and actually excessively large missile launcher on top, which should really, as I previously mentioned, be intended for ships. In the end, let's take a look at an almost incredibly unbelievable video from Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv, yes, a city that has never been under Russian control. The Russians advanced into the suburbs, temporarily captured the airport, but not the whole city. And here we are currently witnessing scenes that very strongly bring to mind the brutal terror tactics used by organizations like ISIS or Hamas. Namely, we have the situation, I hope you can see it, that here a woman, we see her here, I'll try to highlight it, in red. This woman is going to a group of soldiers. We see her standing by the soldiers right next to them carrying a bag. And believe it or not, there is a hidden bomb inside it. Neither the woman nor the soldiers have any idea about it. This apparently involves a woman, according to reports from Ukrainian media, who received money to carry a bag that had been handed to her by someone unknown. She was supposed to deliver this bag to a group of Ukrainian soldiers, unaware of the bag's content. This implies we are dealing with Russian agents, or at the very least those who sympathize with the Russian invasion forces who provided her with this bag in Mykolaiv, and she then unknowingly sent it on to the soldiers. And we'll just let the video play now. As I mentioned, it's quite unbelievable. There's a bomb here, and at the very moment she approaches with the soldier, when she examines the contents of the bag for the first time, the bag suddenly and unexpectedly explodes. A woman has died, and 4 people around her were injured in this attack, which, as I mentioned, looks very similar to Hamas tactics, for example, in Israel and the Gaza Strip, where Hamas in the past has sometimes used people who were unaware, who didn't know about what was happening, took them, handed them this, instructed them to go to the soldiers, and then detonated these bombs hidden within the flag. The tragic part is, according to Ukrainian media, this woman had a son who was waiting for her in a hotel in Mykolaiv. This suggests that it is believed she actually intended to return to her son after she had received several thousand rubles as payment for delivering this particular bag to its destination. However, what she didn't realize was that she had been ensnared by a Russian agent who cunningly used her as an unsuspecting suicide bomber to strategically target the Ukrainian army here in Mykolaiv. Let's take a quick look at it on the map, because as I previously mentioned, Mykolaiv is a location that wasn't under Russian control, meaning the Russians couldn't exert their reign of terror in the conventional way they typically do. That's why, as shown here below, is the city of Mykolaiv, where everything happened near the city of Odessa. That's roughly here, and just another attempt by the Russian army to advance here to kill Ukrainian soldiers, even though they can't directly get hold of them, because it's relatively far from the front line. However, and this shows once again, Russia has agents, meaning these terror agents operate in Ukrainian cities. We've also seen attacks in Kiev in the past. This means that one is quite capable of launching these asymmetric attacks beyond conventional warfare along the front to attack Ukrainian soldiers. In this unfortunate case, tragically at the cost of a mother and her young child.